All right, so today we're going to be discussing sensory integration. So first and foremost, let's discuss what actually sensory integration is. It's a neurobiological model of an intervention designed for the individual with a learning disability. It involves sensory stimulation to the individual to improve the way the brain processes and organizes sensation. Moreover, sensory integration is the process by which people register, modulate, and discriminate sensations through the sensory systems to provide purposeful adaptive behaviors in response to the environment. So overall, it's a way of handling the sensory input through the environment. So in the first two, or second and third rather, quote to your notice, it's by this Ayers, and this is going to be the individual who is most profoundly associated with sensory integration as a whole. So we will go back and talk about her just a little bit. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about the various forms of sensory. Sensations. So how do we get sensory? So here I have the systems over here, but the basic meaning of it is you can get it through touch, sight, sound and hearing, smell, taste, movement, and body awareness. So all of these can influence the sensory input of an individual, and we will discuss this a little bit further later. So to get a little bit of a background, as I mentioned, Agene Ayers is commonly known as it's called ASI, which is the Ayers Sensory Integration. It got a lot of hype and started in 1972, and it's an assessment to measure sensory integration with a core set of essential interventions. So a little bit more like what actually causes this therapy to come about is with problems effectively regulating sensory input, and this can limit the individual's way of life if they can't properly regulate it. Therapists gain an understanding of the cognitive and sensory systems that kind of pair together with this that can cause the underlying reasons for sensory distress. And it's important to realize that this can be hyposensitive or hypersensitive. We talked about that earlier in the semester, but it's how they're actually responding to the sensory input, if they're getting too much or too little sensory. So just a little bit of information on the bottom. Sensory input can be affected by the environment. It can be caused by activity challenges and sensory experiences if something is more oversensitive to the individual. So, for example, if they went to a baseball game, that's the environment. It's going to be really loud. Might cause for overstimulation with the auditory system. All right, some more information. Sensory processing challenges are neurologically based. It's the inability to integrate sensory systems by regulating them as is typically done in the body. So it's just this air and regulating that individuals have trouble with. It also causes for issues with organizing responses, adapting to situations and moods, and functioning in interactions and learning content due to this. I want to look at the prevalence of sensory integration as a whole. I found this statistic that said about 40 to 80% of children have problems regulating sensory. 3 to 11% of adults with developmental disabilities have problems relating to sensory processing. And 10 to 12% of individuals who don't necessarily have a developmental diagnosis or have been diagnosed, like they've gone to a doctor and there's nothing necessarily wrong, do actually have sensory processing issues as the only thing. Often it's a pairing with sensory integration. So for example, if you have autism, you're likely to have a sensory integration lack or disability with it. So what are some of the reactions that can come about with sensory integration or the lack of when needing sensory? Irritability, withdrawal, avoidance of textures and foods, distractibility, fearful reactions. And over here we have some limitations. So it could limit the individual's ability to attend to a task, limit the individual's ability to perform and coordinated motor activities, limit the individual's ability to plan or sequence tasks and events, and limit the individual's action to perform self-care, develop social relationships, and participate in family activities due to this overstimulation or lack of stimulation. Either way, it is just causing a distraction for the individual. So we noted above that AIRS has her system, and this is kind of just like a little bit of a tidbit of the methods of assessing if an individual may need sensory integration therapy. So first, there's going to be observations of the individual in their natural setting. If you interview them or observe them in a room where they're not used to, they are going to act differently than at home, so it's important to view them in their natural setting. Then there's going to be caregiver and teacher interviews to see how the student is actually acting. Standardized testing is not too popular, but it was noted. And there'll be a structural clinical observation. And this is all used to see if the ASI approach will benefit the student or not. So where does sensory integration occur? It can occur in occupational therapy, physical therapy, schools, and facilities that have sensory gyms for the students or individuals to partake in. One of the big things with sensory integration is having a sensory diet. So what necessarily is a sensory diet? So diet stands for do an informal assessment, individualize, environmental supports, and the power senses. Basically, it just means that the student is going to have parts of their day or schedule to have a break and have sensory input, whether it be in the form of blowing bubbles, playing with a steamroller, going for a walk with a special vest, being in a beanbag chair sandwich, when you use weighted blankets or a weighted vest, doing wall push-ups, anything just to get that input of sensory. So the first case study I have is looking at an individual named John. His issues were sensory seeking and overstimulation. The goals of this study was to improve fine motor skills, sit still, pay attention, self-feed, and participate. In order to do this, the sensory integration interventions were as followed. Being placed on a sensory diet, bounce up and down on a therapy ball, deep pressure, the use of felt to improve tactile needs. The outcome is fine motor skills were improved and the nervous system calmed down due to these methods. Thus, John could focus on his work better. The second case study is of a girl, we're going to call her Jane Doe. She's a 6-year-old female with autism spectrum disorder, as was John. All of these case studies focused on autism. She did previous therapies such as ABA and OT on and off since the age of 3, as well as speech therapy, but she was still having issues with regulating her sensory. So Jane Doe, what were the problems she was facing? She was gravitationally insecure, overly responsive to the vestibular sensory input, auditory and visual sensory processing issues, behavioral regulation issues, which led to emotional outbursts, screaming, hyperciliary behavior. She had poor eye contact and delayed gross motor skills. With sensory integration theory, by just adding sensory into her day, she was able to become more flexible with her routine. She was less fearful and rigid with behavior. She was more at ease. She had a quicker response time with directions. She processed the information a lot better because she wasn't distracted by the sensory need input, and she improved her vestibular processing. Case 3 focuses on an named Mikey. When observed with the sensory profile, he had probable to definite differences in sensory regulation, sensory seeking, and sensory avoidance, which led to screaming and flopping on the floor, along with poor motor coordination is what Mikey was facing in his day-to-day life. So some of the sensory integration that they added. We had talked about earlier about sensory gyms as being a form of where sensory integration could take place. Above here is just a picture of some materials that could be found in a sensory gym. This is what was used for Mikey. They used a platform swing with a ball with a hoop nearby. They also added visual schedules to help with transitions. And he got sensory through weighted blankets and weighted vests. One of the important things to do with sensory integration is to look at the environment to see if there's anything that is causing distress. So, for example, Mikey's alarm clock was too loud, which was causing him distress in the morning. What they did was they muffled the sound to create less auditory sensation, and this improved Mikey's mornings better. In this study, it was noted that sensory integration should be paired with other methods. It should not be the sole source of therapy. The outcome is that Mikey's case is still ongoing, but the notion seemed to assist in the sensory deprivation and hyposensitivity to the world around him. Is it evidence-based? Yes and no. So due to the format of the study, the randomization of the study, the lack of standard intervention protocol, and the limited meaningful outcome measures, it's hard to judge if it is. It does benefit, but as noted in the previous slide, it should definitely pair with another method. It's important to pair this because the student may benefit from other methods of therapy as well, just besides sensory. This will help them focus. I did want to touch on a couple of examples of what sensory integration could look like in a classroom. So over here, I have a Rubik's Cube that I modified. It basically has different tactile feelings. So this one's going to be kind of like shimmery. This one I have hard and soft felt. And this way the student can just not only twist, but they can feel all the different sides. And over here, we're going to have the bag swing and platform swing is what you would add. And these can be used to either fidget with or to have a sensory break with. Some schools even have a sensory room, as does the school I work with. So the school I work with, we have a ball pit. Not only can the students kick, throw, and just kind of like play around in the ball pit, they can jump in. This kind of gets them their sensory. We also have a steamroller to allow that deep body pressure to go through. All right, next we have a sensory wall at my school. Not all schools have this, but I think it's really awesome. So the students can not only like push a race car track, there's different lights on the third panel. There's music you can hit and play. We have a bell. You can get different textures throughout the whole wall. So that's really awesome for those students to be able to kind of pick what they want and to get their sensory input through that. We also have a steamroller ramp sensory stimulation therapy slide. So students climb up and then go down the steamroller slide. The kids have a ton of fun with this. They seem to call it just the bumpy slide. But it's really fun and a way to get sensory input and a sensory break. Students can work for this or it can be part of their sensory diet implemented in their daily schedules. So the overall interest and impact of sensory integration, I'm a huge fan of it. We use it a lot at the school I work with. I think what I really like and what I'm interested in is the diversity and how many different ways you can integrate sensory into a classroom. If a student does have sensory-based needs, there's so many modifications and accommodations that you can actually do for the student to provide ease to their day. It's important to realize what your student actually needs. So every student is different. So knowing how to modify that. And don't be afraid to think outside the box. As noted like above, like I took a Rubik's Cube and modified the textures. You could get picture frames and do different textures inside of it. There's so many different ways to integrate it simply as just blowing bubbles. And lastly, over here I have my sources. I hope you enjoyed learning about sensory integration.